I'm very pleased to be here today for The Economist Sustainability Week for a session on the key technologies needed to prevent a climate disaster. My name is Arjun Ramani. I'm The Economist Global Business and Economics correspondent, currently in San Francisco. And I'm very pleased to welcome two eminent guests here. Joanna Chow Krelick is the president of the Union of Concerned Scientists, a leading science-based advocacy organization that combines technical analysis and advocacy to create and implement innovative, practical solutions to a healthy, safe, and sustainable future. Welcome, Joanna.
Thank you.
And secondly, I'm pleased to introduce Jonathan Weiner, co-founder and co-CEO of Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners, which is backed by Alphabet and the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. SIP applies innovative technology to infrastructure systems, advancing scalable solutions to society's biggest challenges. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you.
So our theme for sorry. So our theme for today's session is what technologies are needed to avert climate disaster. So I'm excited to ask both our guests about the tech that they're most excited about, what challenges they will face in terms of gaining adoption at scale, and what governments can do to accelerate this process. So perhaps I'll start fairly broad. So in the past several years, one thing that I've read a lot about is progress we've seen on solar energy, which I think is one of the key parts of our climate solution. So on the capability side, we've seen some interesting data. The cost per unit of solar energy has fallen almost 85% in the last decade. So I think we've seen a lot of progress there. And if I could perhaps break it into two parts, both the capability and the adoption. On the adoption side, for example, in the US and the United Kingdom, the share of energy that's come from solar has actually increased from about 0.2% of total energy a decade ago to over 4% today. So we're seeing improvements on both fronts, though, of course, there's a lot more to do. So using that framing, I wonder if I could ask Joanna, you first. What do you see as the bigger constraint out of those two, the fundamental tech or the adoption? And how do you think that's going to evolve?
Thank you, Arjun, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I'd say, as the Union of Concerned Scientists, we would come down firmly on the biggest challenge being on the adoption and implementation side. As you've just cited with the great data, there's a lot of progress and a lot of momentum already. We already have in hand so many of the essential technologies that we need to transition to a clean and green and prosperous future, including, innovations and technologies in solar, as you mentioned, in wind, technologies that boost efficient energy use and storage, and so much more. I'm happy to talk a bit about solar, and one of the technologies I'm especially excited about are microgrids that can really be implemented at the community level and provide affordable, reliable energy and energy independence for communities across the country. But I'd say that certainly the biggest constraints are on the technology side, making existing technologies even more efficient and, more importantly, more widely available, so that we can deliver, the broadest, most scalable impact, climate, health benefits, economic benefits for the greatest number of people. At the end of the day, I'll just say that technology alone is neither a magic bullet nor the biggest hurdle. And what we really need to be tackling is political will, frankly, to get the job done at the speed, scope, and scale required to avoid climate catastrophe. I'm happy to talk more about what I see as the biggest constraints, but in a nutshell, I'd say they come in four buckets. Holding fossil fuel companies accountable for their lies and their damage to our air, land, and water, committing to policy incentives and standards that truly help consumers and companies do the right things and stop doing the bad things, increasing access to clean energy technology and solutions, so that ordinary people across the country and around the world can participate in a clean energy future, and updating market rules and structures to build out the grid and put clean energy solutions on a level playing field. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jonathan, for that very detailed outline of what we need to do moving forward. Jonathan, I wonder if you could pick up right there and give us your perspective on where you see the bigger constraint, whether it's kind of on the tech innovation side or on the adoption side. Of course, both matter. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about where you see the biggest challenges.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a great question, and I wish there were a simple answer, that it's this or it's that. But the reality of climate change and the energy transition, as people are beginning to call it more broadly, is that this is really a systems level problem. And if you just think at the highest level, and you have sort of generation over here and innovation and different types of alternative energy generation, the grid itself, transmission and distribution, and how that's architected, and what roles both bidirectionality and energy storage might play in a re-architecting of that, all the way down to the consumer preferences, but also energy efficiency and how we can be more responsive at the grid edge and provide grid edge flexibility. And you think of that all as like a system. You start to get some innovation in one area of that system, and it puts pressure and creates opportunities in other pieces of that system. And solar, for example, starting out thinking about sort of utility scale generation, as prices started to fall, creating the intermittency that comes with stressing the grid at certain moments where there's a lot of generation, creates the opportunity for storage, for example. Or on the other side, if you go down to either the microgrid side or even just PV on rooftops, how does that actually impact consumer behaviors, and how do people value things like consuming renewable energy in sort of virtual net metering and other types of community solar schemes? So it's very hard to just sort of take a single piece of technology and ask, hey, within this system, is the challenge that the technology is not cheap enough yet, or is it that the preconditions for scale haven't yet been met? And then that whole system is kind of wrapped, as Joanna was kind of referring to, in really complicated policy questions, which create the framework in which this operates, shifting consumer preferences and just consumer demand for more sustainable products, goods, and energy. And then occasionally you'll have like a technology from the outside of that system, which could be a game changer. Direct air capture comes to mind as not necessarily economic today, but potentially a game changer to what, really shaking up that system. And so I'd love to tell you there's a simple answer given a piece of technology if we were only slightly more innovative in that technology. But the truth is, as we become more innovative, the whole system has to sort of change down in order to facilitate the overall energy transition.
That's great. And I think I definitely want to ask a little bit more soon about how we can get that type of systems level change. Perhaps before that, I'll just pick up on two kind of parts of the technology kind of stack that both of you mentioned. Joanna, you brought up microgrids, and I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more about where you see those fitting in terms of increasing our use of clean electricity. And then Jonathan, I'll come to you afterwards. You mentioned carbon capture and where you see that fits into the overall picture. So maybe, Joanna, we can
Great.
start with
Thanks,
you on
Arjun.
microgrids.
Yeah, no, and I'll just start by saying that Jonathan and I are in violent agreement that this is a systems problem, and that the climate crisis is probably the biggest collective action problem that humanity has ever faced. Specific to solar microgrids there, we did a recent project in partnership with a community group and a set of environmental justice organizations in Highland Park, which is a neighborhood of Detroit. As you said, Arjun, there's tremendous public interest in solar power, in particular, installing panels on home and business rooftops, large-scale community installations. But really, the major hurdles in sort of broad-scale adoption are access. So one barrier that we encountered in the community-based group that we worked with in Highland Park wasn't that the community wasn't interested and eager. They were. But the utilities there needed to be encouraged to change their rules and incentives to enable uptake and greater participation. And that's just one example. There are so many examples across the country of rules that need to be changed, rules that were sort of set in kind of our our future of our polluting history that actually need to be changed to enable sort of broad scale deployment of clean energy at the local and national scale that's needed. So happy to go into more detail, but truly it is It's in that system. What we really need are breakthroughs in collaboration, collective action, communication, governance, and business model reforms.
That's great. I love that example. I wonder if you could actually, before we move on, just provide a little bit more context for so we could understand kind of what those rule changes and collaborations look like that incentivize adoption in a place like that. Is this something that needs to happen at the legislative level? Is it something where you need, regulators need to provide more clarity regarding, for example, the types of tax credits or, that they're providing for this type of technology adoption, or what exactly does this look like to get that type of adoption?
Yeah, it's a great question, Arjun. So let me just scope out a little bit. And there's a recent article that was pretty hair raising, that showed that in fact there's a huge pipeline of clean energy projects that are like shovel ready and ready to go, but they're not happening right now because they are waiting to get access to the grid. And just to quantify it for our listeners, I'm talking about $2 trillion in wind, solar, and energy storage investments that could fulfill 80% of our clean electricity needs in the United States by 2030. But to unleash those clean energy projects on the grid, we need innovation in the processes and governance structures of the institutions that operate the grid and oversee the planning for new transmission. So I'm talking electric utilities, regional transmission organizations. They're still operating under old market rules and structures that favor fossil fuels over renewable energy resources. That's just one example.
Got it. Thanks. And we'll come back to that in a bit. But before that, I just want to ask Jonathan about carbon capture, which I think you mentioned was one of the kind of technologies where you'd like to see more progress. Could you speak a bit about where that fits into the overall picture and kind of what improvement on that would unlock for us?
Well, well, sure. I'm by no means the world's leading expert on carbon capture. I was using that as an example of a technology that is fundamentally outside of the system of the existing energy markets, where you have this energy transition, trying to change generation mix, change distribution, and change grid edge flexibility to sort of make that all work as a system. There are a number of different technologies in direct air capture. These are large plants that basically pull carbon out of the air. There are innovations that have been taking place over the last several years in what's called the sorbent, or the material that is used to actually attract the carbon out of the air. And there are interesting applications of where you can get the core energy necessary to, cause the reactions that power DAC. The real challenge on that in that space is where's the revenue source? And if you're sequestering the carbon, and you don't have an industrial use for the CO2, where is the business model there? I think one interesting thing that's happened recently, we've been fascinated by, we've been following it, is that a consortia of companies, commercial companies. Stripe was a part of it. Google was a part of it. I think it was Nike was a part of it. Maybe Starbucks was a part of it. I can't remember the exact list, but they came together under title of this consortia called Frontier, and they actually entered into a forward purchase agreement, which is a way of providing revenue, if you will, to incentivize people to build these types of systems going forward. This is an interesting moment. And if you think about what's happening here, we have a technology that everyone can acknowledge, hey, if this could get to scale and could become economic, could be a game changer for the system that we're trying to innovate within. But interestingly enough, rather than governments coming forward with various types of either regulation to force, carbon trading or a direct public subsidy for these types of entities, a series of corporations have come together from a voluntary carbon offset perspective of wanting to be able to say credibly to their customers that we are sustainable, that we are offsetting our carbon footprint, and therefore we're willing to enter into this really innovative type of contract to help bring this technology to scale. I think technology has ways to go. And like I said, I'm not a leading scientist in this space who can comment on exactly where the challenges are and what it would take to have a huge impact on the climate crisis. I do think it's a really interesting moment of people stepping outside the existing system and saying, hey, without governments and without all the regulation, is there a way that we can move some of these technologies forward?
I really like that Stripe consortium example, in the sense it provides kind of a market or monetary incentive for carbon sequestration. So maybe I'll try to link that to what you both mentioned earlier in terms of systems level change. many people, especially some economists, believe that market-based solutions such as carbon taxes or cap and trade, as I think the European Union have, are the best way to kind of efficiently incentivize both the development and adoption of green technologies. But it seems like, when I hear both of you describing what system levels change looks like too, there's a lot more to it. So what's your view on why that is? And I kind of, going back to the solar example, I just wonder, if we have all this improvement in the price of clean energy, eventually won't it just outcompete kind of the legacy fossil fuels in a sense? What is kind of the missing piece in that picture? I wonder if you could spell that out, and maybe Joanna, if you want to start, and then I'll go to you, Jonathan.
So what I really loved about Jonathan's examples is his focus again on the systems approach, on consortium and coalitions, and the recognition that no one organization or sector is going to be able to solve this equation, but we all have to be working together using multiple tools. And I just say that, market-based solutions such as carbon tax, cap and trade, et cetera, putting a price on carbon can be a powerful way, one way to help ensure that both the cost of carbon, in other words, the devastating climate impacts that carbon emissions cause, and the benefits of transitioning to clean energy are better reflected in our energy production and consumption choices. So, a price on carbon and other market-based sort of mechanisms can and do have a role, but at the Union of Concerned Scientists, we support a well-designed carbon price as part of sort of a spectrum or a menu of climate and clean energy solutions that need to be working together. And we've also been really clear in our research, and the independent data sort of shows that a carbon price alone or any one mechanism is going to be insufficient to address the climate crisis, and that we need to be working on multiple fronts and on sort of a set of complementary approaches and policies.
Got it. Thanks. And Jonathan, maybe if you want to chime in and add your view on
Yeah, on carbon
what we need
market.
in terms of the systems approach
Yeah,
versus just kind of market pricing.
yeah, so you have the system, and then we're talking about like what are ways to jolt or change the sort of inertia of that system. And obviously, technology is changing some of the internal dynamics, and we talked that there could be an outside technology change. Another big change would be, what you're describing, which are more robust and stronger carbon markets. There's a lot of challenge and innovation that'd be necessary there too, right? Like for 20 some odd years, we've been trying to create various different forms of carbon markets. Ignore for a minute the huge policy challenges of exactly what that should look like, and that is enormous. Ignore for a moment the need for collaboration across multiple different geographies in doing so, also an enormous challenge. I think the actual mechanisms of those marketplaces are challenging as well. The measurement, reporting, and verification that enables people to actually understand their carbon footprint, let alone trade assets in carbon, has been, a challenging space. There are registries that have done good work creating deep scientific methodologies that allow us to start to understand some of that stuff. But if you actually wanted to scale those, it'd be very challenging. If you actually want to create a market in them, I think we've seen some of the limitations of that, both from the regulated market and the voluntary market. There are some interesting things in blockchain that people are starting to do that I think could be really powerful. But again, coming back to Joanna's point, all of these things are deeply, deeply complicated and deeply interwoven. Even if you had the well-functioning market that you're just describing that would provide greater economic incentive to make renewable energy projects even more economic, where in some cases they're already economic, Joanna already pointed out the grid would need a massive upgrade in order to make the geographies where those resources are available, possible to come online. So it would take a concerted effort, and it will take in a number of these different areas. It's very, very hard to peel off a single piece of this, whether it be the carbon market or the policy or falling prices in solar, and say this alone is the answer. It's really collectively over time the system sort of evolves to a different end state.
Great. And I think that point really rings through in what both of you have said throughout this session. It's kind of, there's really no silver bullet to this. A lot of these interventions are kind of complementary, and you need to bring a lot of different actors together in coordination. So I think that's a good place for us to stop here, given we're at time. So I want to thank both of you for a really fascinating, enlightening conversation, Jonathan and Joanna. And thank you to our audience for listening, and stay tuned for our next event. We have many more.